The late afternoon of June 3, 1964 had settled over New York with the specific humid weight that the city carried in early summer before the heat became something people organized their days around rather than simply endured. And Frank Sinatra was in a taxicab on 7th Avenue moving toward a dinner engagement. He was already 20 minutes late for when the cab stopped in traffic, and Frank Sinatra looked out the window to his left and saw a woman standing on the sidewalk in front of a music store that was in the process of closing, standing with the particular quality of someone who has just been told something they did not expect to be told, and who has not yet finished absorbing it. And the woman was holding a violin case with both hands pressed against her chest in the way that people hold things they are afraid of losing. And Frank Sinatra watched her for the 30 seconds his cab remained stationary in the traffic, and could not have said afterward why he had kept watching her rather than looking away, except that there was something in the quality of her stillness that registered as significant in the way that certain things register as significant before you have understood why. The traffic moved, and the cab moved, and Frank Sinatra arrived at the dinner, which was at a private club on East 55th Street, and which involved 12 people around a table who were in the middle of a conversation about a film project that 3 of them were developing, and that 3 others had opinions about, and that the remaining 4 were mainly eating during. And Frank Sinatra sat through 2 courses and most of a third before excusing himself at 8 o'clock and telling the cab driver on the way back to his hotel to go past 7th Avenue and the music store, which the driver did without questioning, because people who rode in cabs in New York told drivers to go past things all the time for reasons the drivers did not need to understand. The music store was dark, closed for the evening, and there was no woman standing in front of it, and Frank Sinatra sat in the cab looking at the darkened storefront for a moment, and then told the driver to take him back to the pier. And in his suite, he poured himself a bourbon and sat in the armchair, and tried to understand why a stranger standing on a sidewalk, holding a violin case, had occupied a portion of his attention for the better part of 3 hours during a dinner he was supposed to be engaged with. And the answer he arrived at was not a complete answer but was something, which was that the expression on the woman's face had been one that he recognized, had been the expression that people wore when something they had been depending on had just been removed from the set of things they could depend on. And Frank Sinatra had seen that expression enough times in enough different circumstances to have developed a kind of reflexive attention toward it. The following morning, Frank Sinatra had his assistant call the music store on 7th Avenue, and Frank Sinatra's assistant was a resourceful woman named Patricia, who had been doing this kind of thing for Frank Sinatra for 6 years, and who knew how to extract information from situations without making the extraction seem like what it was. And Patricia called the music store and spoke with the owner, and in the course of a natural conversation, learned that the woman who had been standing in front of the store the previous afternoon was named Vera Molinari, that she was 34 years old, that she had been studying violin since she was 6, and had been performing with a chamber ensemble in New York for 8 years, and that she had come to the music store the previous afternoon because she had read in a notice in the window that the store was going out of business, and had been hoping to negotiate the purchase of a particular violin that the store owned, and that Vera had been playing for 2 years on a rental arrangement, a violin that had been made in 1887 by a luthier in Cremona, and that produced a quality of sound that her teacher had told her was not something she would easily find again if the violin went to another owner. The store was going out of business because the owner, a man named Stefan who had run it for 31 years, and who loved instruments with the specific devotion of someone who had spent their life in service to music without being able to play it themselves, had developed a condition that made it impossible for him to continue working. And Stefan had told Vera the previous afternoon that he intended to sell his entire inventory at auction to a dealer who had made an offer for the complete stock, and that the Cremona violin would be included in that sale, and that the auction price the dealer was likely to command for the violin exceeded anything Vera could pay, because Vera was a chamber musician who earned what chamber musicians earned in New York in 1964, which was enough to sustain a life organized around music, but not enough to accumulate the kind of savings required to purchase an 1887 Cremona at auction prices. Patricia relayed all of this to Frank Sinatra, and Frank Sinatra asked what the violin was worth, and Patricia told him the figure that Stefan had quoted. And Frank Sinatra asked what Vera Molinari could afford to pay, and Patricia said she didn't know exactly but had gathered from the conversation with Stefan that it was substantially less than the auction value. And Frank Sinatra sat with this information for a moment, and then asked Patricia to find out the name of the dealer who had made the offer for the store's inventory. And Patricia found this out by noon, and Frank Sinatra called the dealer himself that afternoon and made an offer for the Cremona violin specifically, not for the complete inventory. And the dealer, who was accustomed to the pragmatic arithmetic of acquisition and sale, accepted the offer because the price Frank Sinatra named was fair, and because selling one item directly was simpler than including it in a larger transaction. And by 4 o'clock that afternoon, Frank Sinatra owned an 1887 Cremona violin that he had no ability to play and no intention of keeping. The next question was how to get the violin to Vera Molinari in a way that did not make Vera feel like the recipient of a celebrity gesture, which was the form of help that Frank Sinatra was least interested in providing, because it was the form that put the giver at the center rather than the recipient. And Frank Sinatra thought about this for the better part of an evening before arriving at an approach that seemed right, which was to have Stefan, the store owner, contact Vera and tell her that a buyer for the violin had been found who was willing to sell it to Vera at the price she could afford, the difference being covered by an anonymous party who had a specific interest in the violin, remaining with the musician who had been playing it rather than moving to a collector. And Frank Sinatra had his attorney draft the relevant documents and had Stefan's participation arranged through a brief phone call in which Frank Sinatra explained what he wanted Stefan to do, and Stefan, who was 68 years old and had been closing his store with genuine grief, had listened and said that he would do it and had said nothing else, and the call had lasted 4 minutes. Vera Molinari received a call from Stefan 3 days later telling her that the situation had changed, that a buyer had been located who was willing to transfer the violin to Vera for the amount she could afford, and Vera had asked who the buyer was, and Stefan had said an anonymous party who wanted the violin to stay with her. And Vera had been silent for a moment, and then had asked if she should ask more questions, and Stefan had said that, in his experience, the people who arranged things anonymously arranged them that way because they preferred not to be asked more questions. And Vera had said she understood, and had purchased the violin the following week for an amount that represented the entirety of what she had saved toward this instrument over 3 years, and had carried it back to her apartment on West 82nd Street, and had placed it on the stand in her practice room, and had sat down and played it for 2 hours without stopping. And when she finished playing, she sat in her practice room in the particular exhaustion and gratitude that follows 2 hours of playing an exceptional instrument, and understood that something that had seemed to be closing had instead remained open, that the thing she had been preparing to lose had stayed, and that she did not know who had made this possible and might never know. Frank Sinatra was in Los Angeles by the time Vera Molinari carried her violin home, had flown back the day after the transaction was completed, and the Cremona violin and the woman who played it had receded from his daily attention in the way that resolved things receded, cleanly and without residue, and he did not think about Vera Molinari again with any frequency, did not follow her career or check whether the violin continued to suit her, or do any of the things that people who expect gratitude do to keep themselves informed of the effect of their actions. What Frank Sinatra did not know was that Vera Molinari spent the following decade trying to determine who the anonymous buyer had been, not because she intended to repay the difference, which she understood she could not, but because she felt that carrying the knowledge of a significant act of generosity without being able to direct gratitude toward its source was a kind of imbalance that she could not entirely make peace with. And she asked Stefan, and Stefan told her that he had been asked to keep the confidence and intended to keep it. And she made inquiries through the dealer, and the dealer said only that the buyer had preferred to remain anonymous. and she eventually accepted that the information was not available to her, and tried instead to honor the gift through the quality of her playing, which was the only currency she had that was proportional to what she had received. In 1971, Vera Molinari gave a performance at Carnegie Hall as part of a chamber music series that received a review in the New York Times describing her playing as possessing a tonal quality rarely heard outside the greatest concert halls of Europe, and the reviewer specifically mentioned the violin she was playing, described it as exceptional, and noted that instruments of its quality were becoming increasingly rare in performance settings as they moved into private collections. And someone clipped this review and sent it to Frank Sinatra without a note, just the review in an envelope with his address. And Frank Sinatra read it in his suite at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas during a residency, and then set it on the side table and sat with it for a moment, and then folded it and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, where he sometimes kept things he wanted to keep close rather than filing away. And he left it there for 3 days before eventually placing it in the leather document folder where he kept things he considered worth keeping. The Carnegie Hall Review and the violin and the woman holding it on a 7th Avenue sidewalk in the summer of 1964 were connected by a sequence of events so private and so deliberately obscured that they would have been essentially impossible to reconstruct from the outside. And Frank Sinatra had no reason to believe they would ever be reconstructed because he had been careful precisely to prevent that, had structured the transaction through enough intermediaries that the chain back to him was theoretical rather than traceable. And this was not because Frank Sinatra required the anonymity for his own psychological reasons, but because Vera Molinari required it for hers. Because a person who has received significant help from someone they cannot think carries a kind of freedom that a person who must carry the obligation of gratitude does not carry. And Frank Sinatra had understood this without being told it, had understood it from watching people receive help over the course of a career that had put him in a position to provide it, had understood that the most useful form of help was often the form that left the recipient feeling that the good thing that had happened through the world's ordinary operations rather than through someone's deliberate intervention, and that this feeling, even if it was not entirely accurate, was what allowed a person to move forward with something like confidence rather than with something like debt. And Vera Molinari moving forward through a decade of excellent playing with a Cremona violin that she believed she had purchased through ordinary transaction was exactly what Frank Sinatra had wanted, was the entire point of the careful arrangement through Stefan and the dealer and the attorney, was the shape of the thing as he had intended it. And New York in the summer of 1964, with its humid weight and its taxicabs, and its music stores going dark at the end of their history had produced, in 30 seconds of traffic stillness on 7th Avenue, a moment of attention that had moved through the world quietly and without announcement, and had arrived at a practice room on West 82nd Street in the form of an instrument that stayed when it might have gone.